Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs here at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
This is Sam Wang here, professor of neuroscience and molecular biology and founder of the Princeton Election Consortium. Good day, Julian.
How are you? So last week we concluded that the best way to understand the Republican convention seemed to be worldwide wrestling. Donald Trump, Hulk Hogan, Sergeant Slaughter, they all seem to be one and the same. Now we're turning our attention, though, to Philadelphia, where the Democrats have gathered to have their political party. Everyone assumed it would be a pretty boring event, certainly compared with what we saw in Cleveland, but it started off with some heat of its own. Emails raised all kinds of concerns about whether the party had unfairly helped Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. We even had a little bit of a James Bond storyline with the Russians being behind the data dump, working with Trump. There were boos from the floors and contentious comments from the comedian Sarah Silverman telling her fellow Burns supporters to get a grip. Michelle Obama delivered what was considered one of the best speeches, telling us why she was with her and why Trump is not plausible. We saw the historic moment of Hillary Clinton gaining the actual nomination, winning it, and her husband telling us the story of their romance as a way to humanize her. And central to everything we've heard, I think, all the speeches and the basic promise is the argument that Democrats in the end, the modern Democratic Party, that they, not Trump and his demagoguery, they say are better for average working and middle class Americans who are struggling through difficult economic times. This has been at the heart of the party's tradition since the New Deal, and this is what they're going to say. What they have said is the reason Democrats are better to actually deal with the concerns of the so-called forgotten man rather than what Donald Trump is talking about. So today I thought that maybe we could talk a little bit about the Democratic Party, what it's about, what kinds of issues they should be tackling in the coming days and the coming months. And I wanted to start with something I saw this morning, and since we do this show, I have the perfect person to ask. It's a new column by Nate Silver, a piece in 538. It was called The Mythology of Trump's Working Class Support, and Silver argues that news accounts of Trump as the candidate of working class rebels against the Republican elite are wrong. He finds, quote, as compared with most Americans, Trump voters are better off. The median household income of a Trump voter so far in the primaries is about $72,000 based on estimates derived from exit polls and Census Bureau data. That's lower than the $91,000 median for Kasich voters, but it's well above the national median household income of about $56,000. It's also higher than the median income for Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders supporters. So Sam, you're someone who crunches the numbers. I'm sure you saw the piece, so I'm curious what you think and how much credence we should give in his analysis here.
Yeah, Julian, I saw that piece a little while ago, and I thought the headline was interesting, and of course I thought the data was interesting. My take on it is that the conclusion is basically incorrect. There's a data analysis error here. If you read that piece carefully, he admits to, but doesn't really quite get into the import of, which is that you can't really compare different samples like that. So the key comparison here that is claimed is comparing Republican primary voters with the general population in terms of income. And that's fundamentally a mistake because we know that primary voters aren't like the general population, both on the Democratic and the Republican side. These are the most committed partisans, the ones who are willing to go to the polls and go vote during primaries. And it's hard enough to predict how primaries are going to go compared with polls, but to figure out some property of the voting electorate is really an issue. So I think the key comparison here that makes any sense is not comparing the income of Republican primary voters, say Trump supporters, with the general population, but to compare them with one another. And so the key finding here that is probably valid is that within Republican voters who are committed to voting in the primaries, who did vote, Trump supporters are of lower income than Rubio voters, Cruz voters, Kasich voters. And so that within-group comparison is the valid comparison. So I think that basically the conclusion of that piece is wrong, and the headline is as well. I will say that there's some other data that is, I think, more compelling, and a number of analysts have taken a stab at this. The kind of thing that is known, I think, is more in line with what you're saying about the forgotten man and that kind of idea, which is that Neil Irwin and Josh Katz over at the New York Times did a great piece back in May, around the same time that this 538 piece came out. They did a great piece looking at the geography of Trumpism, and they found that Trump support was strong in places where people didn't finish high school, where lots of people live in trailers, where lots of people work in old economy industries, manufacturing, right? So this, screams out Rust Belt. And so what appears to be the case is that there's a strong correspondence between Trump support, at least the abundance of Trump support in a county, and those things I just talked about. So I think it fits pretty well with the image that's coming out in the press, which is Trump supporters being people who feel left out, who feel left behind. And I think that 538 piece is a mistake with the data, and that the data is okay, but the interpretation is more like what Irwin and Katz have done at the Times.
Do we know how the general Republican electorate compares to the Democratic electorate? There's been this storyline for a long time about Democrats losing support with voters who, based on their economic interests, should be voting Democratic, that Democratic policies tend to be more progressive, they are more supportive of unions, they're more supportive of a social safety net, and yet Republicans argue that they have appealed to these voters since the 1960s, and right now Trump, to win, Trump has to win from what we've seen states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, and so these votes are going to be really important. Not wealthy Americans, and not poor Americans, but middle and working class Americans. And what I don't have a great sense of is how realistic is that, and I don't know what we know about that. Can Republicans, have they actually dug into this part of the electorate?
Well, if you look at the correlates of Trump support, that reflects one facet of the Republican Party. I will say that there's a sense in which it's really in either party's advantage, it's really in voters' advantage, I should say, to form coalitions in the form of one of the major two parties, because our system is winner take all, and we have congressmen who are elected by single district, we have a president who is elected through the Electoral College, we have senators who are elected, again, in most cases, first past the post, or a plurality vote. In some cases, there's a runoff that leads to a majority. But generally speaking, the American system really doesn't reward a faction peeling off from a party. That's always gone kind of poorly. I mean, if you think about, say, to think of somebody who's kind of like the Donald Trump, George Wallace, really running on a platform having to do with segregation and race. I mean, race plays a major role in the Trump campaign. So one obvious feature of Republican voters is this whole segment of the population that correlates with Trump support. So if you look at things like, as I said, people who are white with no high school diploma, in the American Community Survey, Irwin and Katz found that there was county by county correspondence between that demographic and Trump support. A few other examples would be, in fact, amount of support in a county for George Wallace back in 1968, a history of voting for segregationists. And an interesting one that I like is percentage of people who report their ancestry as American. Okay, so if you look on the census and you say, well, what race are you anyway? And if somebody says, I'm an American, then those are places where support for Trump is strong. So I guess what I would point out is that increasingly there is this cultural divide between Republicans and Democrats, and it can account for things that seem otherwise kind of odd, like the idea that evangelical Christians seem to strongly support Trump, despite the fact that he doesn't seem like a particularly religious or godly figure.
And what's interesting is Trump is doing some traditional tactics to appeal to these voters. So some of this is not new. So his appeals to race have been a way where either explicitly or implicitly some Republicans have tried to win over these votes. And there's history of Ronald Reagan that argues his use of states' rights as a term was meant explicitly to appeal to Southern whites, or his discussion of quote-unquote welfare queens referring to individuals on welfare, was meant to play up to the white backlash from the 1960s. He's done it with immigration. Trump, I think he has picked up on how that might help, especially given what you just said about questions regarding ancestry in the current environment, as a way to appeal in all parts of the country. This is beyond a Southern backlash on immigration questions to his advantage, even probably states where the presence is not as intense of immigrants or illegal immigrants. It might still work. And the only other part of what Trump is doing, and I'm curious how this will work, I'm not sure, is the whole free trade argument, where he's actually talking about economics directly and using these agreements, which I can't imagine anyone's actually read other than experts. People say
How many people?
That what?
How many people can say what TPP stands for?
Right, or NAFTA for that matter. And yet, symbolically, they really seem to resonate. And Bernie Sanders saw that as well with the Democratic Party. And I think that's another part of the mix we're not sure about, how much that can play in these key states we're talking about that Trump is going to need to win.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about, all the factors that I listed refer to one part of the Republican coalition. So there's, I think that something that has been true all along that's become more apparent with the Trump candidacy is these parts of the coalition where one part of the coalition might be old economy, less educated white voters, and then other parts of the economy might be, say, Chamber of Commerce types who want to have free trade, or say even neoconservatives who are interested in an aggressive posture with other countries. And so it seems like one inadvertent consequence of the Trump candidacy is really emphasizing this one subgroup. And I'm getting pretty out past the data here and asking this question. Does that mean that there can be a rearrangement in future elections where these groups in some ways are up for grabs, right? I mean, here's an example. Trump is making noises that sound like he might be open to an increase in the minimum wage, which is a pretty obvious link to working class people who support him. And so, is that going to fly? Is that a thing that they would like? And I'm just curious about the extent to which there are groups that are up for grabs by either party. Because just to look on the other side of it, if you ask, I don't know, my perception, again, this is, I'd love to get your take on this. My perception is that Democrats were more explicitly connected with, say, white working classes back during the Roosevelt era and back in the pre-civil rights era, and Democrats may say that they're in favor of those classes, but there are large swaths of voters who don't feel that way, evidently, and so what I wonder is to what extent we can see these things a long time ago, and to what extent these things could change in the future.
The story of the Democrats has been what you're saying. So the Democrats used to have a very strong base in the union movement, certainly during the 1930s and to the 1960s. They were very attached to social policies that created what we call a social safety net. Social Security is created in 1935. Medicare is created in 1965. And part of what has happened is that the party broadened its reach, and suburban middle-class voters became much more important, especially on the coasts, and social issues ranging from gay rights to race relations to feminism in the 70s all pushed the party away from some of these issues, or some of this became less pronounced. And at the same time, unions have just become less important in the United States. So in the 30s and 40s, unions are, I think, by the 50s, up to 30% of the workforce is unionized, and now it's much less than that. So Democrats had good reason to do that. That said, so you've had a Democratic Party that's less concerned with some of these bread and butter questions, and you've had a tension play out in the party since the 1980s, where some Democrats, including Bill Clinton, very explicitly say, move away from those issues. Don't feel badly about it. That's the only way the party's going to win. Embrace market-oriented approaches to solutions. be open to free trade and market economics. It's the only way Democrats will do well. And so that's when some of the division between the Democrats and Republicans dissipated. But it's still, you have to look at the two parties relative to where they are against each other. And Republicans still are much more sympathetic to what business wants. And I think this has been clear in where a lot of the campaign donations go and the policies. If you look at the actual policies, Democrats are certainly not as regressive in how they deal with taxation, and they're still much more supportive of the social safety net. If you look at Congress, the Republicans have become much more rightward in the past 30 years, and they are not at all open to some of the kinds of issues that Donald Trump has brought up. So there is certainly a tension between Trump, if he's serious about being more sympathetic to saving Social Security or increasing the minimum wage, where Paul Ryan's going to be. Paul Ryan wants to dramatically cut Medicare and really dig deep into Social Security, and they've had no interest in supporting the kinds of programs that a lot of working Americans want. So it's still hard to see a big realignment. You can see, though, at least this cycle, where more neocons and even business people are open to Hillary Clinton for 2016. This is where part of that Clinton baggage in the primaries becomes an asset. They are a party that is not creating a narrow coalition. They don't believe in that. So I'm not sure that will translate into some long-term shift, but you can imagine her winning some of these more conservative parts of the electorate over, at least for the short term.
Well, let me be a little bit boneheaded about these things. I think it's attractive to think about these policy issues such as the social safety net and so on as being issues that move voters. But let's say that, in fact, the identifier that moves people is cultural instead of drilling into the details of Medicare policy or what have you. One question that one could ask is, what's a simple thing that could actually work with voters? And so the minimum wage issue is one that has the advantage of being short and pithy and doesn't require someone to say, well, wait, so you want to change the Medicare eligibility? Will I be able to choose my doctor? I mean, that just spins off into a complicated conversation that a lot of people don't necessarily have time for. So let's say hypothetically the Democrats get in and they've got, 2 years to get something done, or let's say that the Republicans have 2 years to get in and get something done. In either situation, it feels like a pretty simple thing to say is something like this. Minimum wage as of July 1st is going to be $12 an hour, and it's going to be indexed according to the CPI, so it's going to be indexed by inflation forever. And we, the fill-in-the-blank party, are doing that for you. It strikes me that that could be something that would work a lot better with voters, whether they be white or whatever ethnicity. Feels like it would be a pretty simple thing to understand. And I wonder whether, given the complications of public conversations and cultural whatnot, could something simple cut through all these complicated conversations that people don't necessarily pay much attention to?
I think simplicity is essential, and the Democrats need to understand that right now, this week. They're going to be discussing what distinguishes them from Trump. Part of what they'll just discuss is the personalities of the candidate. Part of what they'll talk about is whether you believe in fear or hope. But part of it will be, what do they have to offer in terms of policy? And the minute you get into a two-sentence explanation of something, you probably lose a lot of voters. And Bernie Sanders was criticized for this in the primaries. People said, he's so simplistic, he's so shallow, and yet I always thought that part of his appeal was that he got right to the essence of issues that he would fight for, and that's compelling. So he said free public education. Instantly the critics came out and said, you can't do that, look at the details, it will cost too much. But there was something appealing, and it's not surprising Hillary Clinton has moved towards some kind of program or promise for free public education for many Americans. Increasing the minimum wage is symbolically very important. but also it has a simplicity about it. We'll go up from this dollar amount to this dollar amount. Are you for $12? Are you for $15? And I think that's something else Democrats should be talking about in the next few days. And you know, protecting things is also a good, simple message. And so we will protect Medicare, they will cut it. Trump complicates that a bit because he has distinguished himself from the rest of the Republican Party, but I think that's also the kind of argument that can be made. One of the arguments about why Social Security was so effective of a policy for Democrats was exactly what you're saying. It wasn't simply that it was a program that really worked or that it really helped elderly people have some security. There was a simplicity about how this worked. While you worked, you paid a tax, and when you were older, you got a monthly benefit. It was simple. It didn't actually capture how all the financing worked, but Democrats could run on that. And when Lyndon Johnson proposes Medicare in the 60s, one of the reasons it's put into the Social Security program is exactly what you're saying. The idea was Americans would understand what it was. You just pay higher Social Security taxes, and now the program will pay for your health care. So I think it's really important, and I do think Democrats have had some trouble often in that they don't get this. And I think certainly on the campaign trail, in the convention in the next few days, let alone once you're in office, you need to frame it in these ways, and you need to make these promises to translate policy to politics and to the campaigns. Otherwise, it's not effective. I think the ones you're talking about, healthcare, education, the minimum wage, are places where this can really resonate. I think infrastructure as a final one can actually be sold. Well, we'll fix your roads, we'll fix the buildings in your community. I think there was always something powerful about public works that Democrats have forgotten. It's also a job for a lot of people.
Yeah, you know, if you drive through Pennsylvania and you go on the Pennsylvania Turnpike or any of those highways, those works project administration things, like these giant tunnels, and I'm not of an age to remember a time before the interstate highway system, but if I stop and think about the fact that I can drive down interstate highways and I can go, Charles Kuralt said, you can drive coast to coast in America now without seeing anything, thanks to the interstate highway system. But anyway, that was a huge accomplishment. And you can go through these tunnels. I mean, these phenomenal things that were built, these giant works, and that is not a thing that is, I think people take for granted that these large things got built. One thing I wanted to point out was that at some level, I'm still thinking about exactly how to process this, but there are areas where Trump is doing pretty well compared with Mitt Romney 4 years ago, and there's areas where he's much weaker, and it feels like it tells us something about things that could change in the future, in some future scene with or without him. There are states where Trump is pretty weak. He's a median of 9 points behind Mitt Romney in states that I've said this before, Utah, Kansas, Missouri, Arizona, North Carolina. So those are states where there's something where the bottom has dropped out for the Republicans. They're probably still going to win all those states, but by much smaller margins, which could have impacts down ticket. But then there are states where Trump runs relatively strong on an equal footing with where things were 4 years ago, and those are states like West Virginia and Pennsylvania. So it makes me think about West Virginia and Pennsylvania. What's going on there? Is it that they're Appalachian states and so it's white working classes? Is it Rust Belt economy? What's going on here? And does it mean that those voters are really coming into the Republican fold and replacing free traders, or does it mean there's other mainline Republicans in these other states up for grabs? Feels like there's this little tiny rumbling of some demographic that could be peeled off depending on what the next generation of candidates looks like.
I think you're right, and it's going to be very important in this campaign. Obviously, part of this is the economy, and Democrats might spend the next few days boasting about everything they're doing, but there is a problem, and it's not registering always with the party. There are these parts, West Virginia and Pennsylvania stand out if those are the states where Trump is doing well and these issues are at play, where you have structural economic changes that have nothing to do with recession and recovery, and they are just not going to recover very well. The new normal is bad, and the Democrats haven't really either been able to address this or spent a lot of time addressing it. Some of this is about the Republican Congress that hasn't dealt with this either. Part of it, though, it's the race and cultural issues you've been talking about, I'm sure, play well in parts of the economy. And we shouldn't underestimate how deep racial animosity, nativist sentiment with immigration, all of that runs really deep in parts of the electorate. This is something that has been clear for decades. And now we're in a period where immigration is at the forefront again, and policing and Black Lives Matter has put race front and center again. And so I'm sure these are issues on the minds of the electorate. And Trump, what's remarkable about him is he's willing to play to these feelings very explicitly. So I don't know which is more important in these two states, but these are the states you'd expect both sets of feelings to be at play. And Trump is betting a lot on, he's willing to lose maybe a state like North Carolina, possibly, if the Clintons make a big push on the issue of race and a backlash against Trump, which would be bad, but as an exchange for how this sentiment can trump up or mobilize feelings of these disaffected workers who are looking for people to blame in this election. There was an article in the Times, a qualitative article, as you'd probably call it, looking at and it was in a magazine. They went to a bar in Pennsylvania and they talked with workers there. I think it was called Duckies. I can't remember exactly. And all they were talking about, the workers, was the impact of both immigration and free trade on why their community was just was pretty devastated. And the reporter said neither were actually the reason that jobs had left that state, she found, and also there was economic growth, just in different sectors of the economy. But those feelings were really powerful for everyone sitting around the bar. And my sense is it's a combo of those two things. And that's what both the Republicans are going to try to use to win these key states. But it's important the Democrats, just thinking of the end of the convention right now, understand that and don't discount those voters and make the kinds of arguments that are more appealing economically. We're actually out of time, though, Sam, believe it or not. So
Really?
We have to wrap up our episode.
Okay.
I hope everyone can join us next week. We'll continue with our discussion. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon on Politics and Polls.